Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. The American Civil War, fought between 1861 and 1865, was the deadliest conflict in U.S. history, pitting the Union in the North against the Confederacy in the South. It was a war rooted in deep divisions over slavery, states' rights, and the future of the nation. What began as a struggle for preserving the Union soon evolved into a fight to redefine America, particularly after President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Over 4 years, hundreds of battles were fought, but some were far more significant than others. These were the turning points that shifted the momentum of the war and determined its outcome. Not every battle in the Civil War had the same level of impact. Some engagements ended in indecisive skirmishes, while others resulted in significant strategic and psychological shifts that changed the course of the war. These turning point battles either marked a dramatic shift in military advantage, crippled one side's ability to continue fighting effectively, or altered public perception of the war's progress. Often, these pivotal battles involved enormous casualties, key territorial gains, or critical political ramifications. When the tide of war shifted after certain battles, so too did the fate of the Confederacy, the Union, and ultimately the United States itself. The significance of these battles extended far beyond the battlefield. They influenced foreign relations, determining whether European powers like Britain and France would recognize the Confederacy. They shaped public morale, either reinforcing support for the war effort or pushing factions towards seeking peace. Additionally, these battles determined military strategy, forcing commanders to adapt, innovate, or suffer devastating defeats. The outcomes of these engagements not only dictated the length and brutality of the war, but also set the stage for Reconstruction and the future of civil rights in America. By the end of the war, the United States had been fundamentally transformed. Slavery was abolished, the power of the federal government was cemented over the states, and the Union emerged stronger, but at a tremendous cost. Understanding the key battles that served as turning points in the war is essential to understanding how America was reshaped and how the consequences of these events still resonate today. In this video, we will explore these pivotal moments, analyzing their impact and how they helped forge the future of the United States. The first major battles of the Civil War set the stage for the brutal and drawn-out conflict that followed. Many Americans, both in the North and South, initially believed the war would be short-lived. Some in the Union expected a swift victory, believing that superior industrial power and a larger population would quickly overwhelm the Confederacy. In the South, many thought their military leadership and home field advantage would secure independence in a matter of months. However, the first major battles shattered these illusions, proving that the war would be far longer and bloodier than anyone had anticipated. The First Battle of Bull Run, also known as the Battle of Manassas, was the first significant land battle of the war, fought in July 1861 in Virginia. At the time, there was immense pressure from the public and politicians for the Union Army to advance quickly and strike a decisive blow against the Confederacy. Many expected that a quick Union victory would force the South to surrender, bringing an early end to the conflict. Union General Irvin McDowell led around 35,000 troops toward the Confederate capital of Richmond, but standing in their way was a Confederate force of roughly 32,000 men under Generals P.G.T. Beauregard and Joseph E. Johnston. At first, the battle seemed to favor the Union. Their troops managed to push back the Confederates early in the fight, leading many to believe that a quick victory was imminent. However, Confederate reinforcements arrived, and under the leadership of General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, the Southern forces held firm. Jackson earned his famous nickname here, as his brigade stood like a stone wall against Union attacks. As the battle continued, the Union troops began to falter. Panic set in, and what had started as an organized retreat turned into a chaotic rout. Soldiers fled back toward Washington, and the Union's hopes of a quick war were crushed. The Confederate victory at Bull Run sent shockwaves through the North. It became clear that the South would not be easily defeated, and the war would not end quickly. The defeat was humiliating for the Union and led to widespread criticism of the military leadership. In the South, however, the victory provided a morale boost, reinforcing the belief that Confederate independence was within reach. But despite their success, the Confederates failed to capitalize on the victory by pursuing the retreating Union forces aggressively. The battle made one thing certain: this would be a long and grueling war. As the war progressed, the scale and brutality of the fighting escalated. Less than a year later, in April 1862, the Battle of Shiloh would drive this reality home even further. Fought in southwestern Tennessee, Shiloh was one of the bloodiest battles in American history up to that point. Union General Ulysses S. Grant led the Northern forces, while Confederate generals Albert Sidney Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard commanded the Southern Army. Unlike Bull Run, Shiloh would not be a short battle with one side quickly retreating. It would be a prolonged, gruesome fight that shocked both the North and South. The battle began with a surprise Confederate attack. Johnston's forces launched an early morning assault on Grant's troops, who were encamped near the Tennessee River. The Confederates pushed the Union soldiers back toward the river, causing chaos and confusion. The Union Army suffered heavy losses, and it appeared that another Confederate victory was imminent. However, as the battle raged on, the tide began to turn. Johnston, the Confederate commander, was fatally wounded during the fighting, which was a devastating blow to Southern morale. His replacement, Beauregard, called off the attacks as night fell, believing that victory was already secured. But Grant was not ready to give up. Overnight, Union reinforcements arrived, and by the next morning, the Northern troops launched a fierce counterattack. The exhausted Confederate forces were driven back, and by the end of the second day of fighting, Grant had secured a hard-fought victory. Though the Union had won the battle, it came at an enormous cost. More than 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The staggering number of casualties was unlike anything seen before in American warfare, shocking the nation and making it clear that the Civil War would be far deadlier than many had anticipated. Shiloh also revealed Grant's determination as a commander. Despite being caught off guard on the first day, he refused to retreat and instead regrouped for a counterattack. His resilience and willingness to endure heavy losses foreshadowed the kind of warfare that would come to define the later years of the war. While some Northern politicians criticized Grant for the high casualties, President Lincoln reportedly defended him, saying, "I can't spare this man. He fights." The battles of Bull Run and Shiloh marked crucial turning points in the early phase of the Civil War. Bull Run shattered the illusion of a quick war, proving that both sides were in for a long and brutal struggle. Shiloh, with its staggering death toll, demonstrated just how bloody that struggle would be. These battles set the stage for even greater conflicts to come, shaping the strategies, morale, and leadership decisions that would ultimately determine the war's outcome. As the Civil War continued into its second year, the focus of the fighting in the Eastern Theater centered around the struggle for control of the capitals, Washington, D.C., in the north and Richmond, Virginia, in the south. The Union aimed to capture Richmond, believing that taking the Confederate capital would deal a devastating blow to the rebellion. Meanwhile, the Confederacy sought to invade the North, weaken Union morale, and possibly gain recognition from European powers like Britain and France. Two of the most crucial battles in this theater, Antietam and Chancellorsville, would prove to be turning points, shaping the course of the war in different but significant ways. In September 1862, the war reached a critical moment with the Battle of Antietam. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had launched his first invasion of the North, hoping that a victory on Union soil would sway European nations to support the Confederacy and convince the Northern public to push for peace. His army crossed into Maryland, a border state with divided loyalties, and planned to strike a major blow against the Union. However, Lee's campaign faced an unexpected setback when a copy of his battle plans, wrapped around a set of cigars, was discovered by Union troops. This intelligence gave Union General George McClellan a rare opportunity to strike Lee's army while it was divided. On September 17, 1862, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, the two armies clashed in what would become the bloodiest single day in American history. The battle unfolded in three main phases, each marked by intense and horrific combat. The fighting began in a cornfield at dawn, where waves of Union and Confederate soldiers charged and countercharged in a scene of chaos and slaughter. Control of the field changed hands multiple times, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. The battle then shifted to the Sunken Road, later known as Bloody Lane, where Union troops launched repeated assaults against well-entrenched Confederate forces. For hours, The two sides engaged in relentless fighting until Union soldiers finally broke through, leaving the road littered with thousands of dead and wounded men. Despite this breakthrough, McClellan hesitated to fully press his advantage. The final and most crucial phase took place at Antietam Creek's Burnside Bridge, where Union forces, under General Ambrose Burnside, struggled to cross a heavily defended Confederate position. After several failed attempts, they finally broke through in the afternoon, threatening to cut off Lee's army from retreat. But at the last moment, Confederate reinforcements arrived, preventing a complete collapse. By nightfall, the battle was over. More than 22,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing, making Antietam the single bloodiest day in U.S. history. Despite the horrific casualties, McClellan failed to deliver a decisive victory. He did not pursue Lee's weakened army, allowing the Confederates to retreat back into Virginia. Although tactically inconclusive, the battle was strategically significant. It halted Lee's invasion of the North and gave President Abraham Lincoln the confidence to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation, announced just days after Antietam, declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory would be freed. This shifted the war's focus from preserving the Union to also ending slavery. It prevented European nations from supporting the Confederacy, as Britain and France were unwilling to back a government fighting to preserve slavery. While the proclamation did not immediately free all enslaved people, it set the stage for the eventual abolition of slavery and redefined the war's purpose. The Eastern Theater continued to see fierce battles, and by May 1863, the Confederacy won one of its most dramatic victories at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Facing a much larger Union force under General Joseph Hooker, Robert E. Lee once again demonstrated his brilliance as a military strategist. The Union had over 130,000 troops, while Lee's Confederate army was less than half that size, only about 60,000 men. Outnumbered and outgunned, Lee made a bold and risky decision. Instead of retreating or fighting defensively, he divided his already smaller army. He sent General Stonewall Jackson on a daring flanking maneuver through the dense forests of Virginia. The Union Army, unaware of what was coming, was caught completely off guard. On May 2nd, Jackson's men launched a surprise attack on the Union's right flank, sending Hooker's troops into chaos. The bold strategy worked. Union forces were routed, and the Confederates claimed a stunning victory. But Chancellorsville came at a terrible cost. During the chaos of battle, Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men while scouting the battlefield at night. He was wounded in the arm, which had to be amputated, and he died of pneumonia several days later. Jackson's death was a severe blow to the Confederate Army. He had been one of Lee's most trusted and skilled generals, known for his aggressive tactics and ability to strike fear into Union forces. Although Chancellorsville was a major Confederate victory, it also had lasting consequences. Lee lost over 13,000 men, troops he could not easily replace. Meanwhile, Hooker's defeat humiliated the Union Army and led to his resignation. Despite his victory, Lee knew that the South could not afford many more battles like this. Lee's success at Chancellorsville emboldened him to launch a second invasion of the North, leading to the next major turning point of the war, the Battle of Gettysburg. But despite the tactical brilliance displayed at Chancellorsville, the loss of Stonewall Jackson and the heavy casualties weakened the Confederate Army at a time when the Union was beginning to grow stronger. Both Antietam and Chancellorsville played crucial roles in shaping the war. Antietam gave Lincoln the opportunity to change the war's purpose by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, which ultimately weakened the Confederacy's ability to gain foreign support. Chancellorsville, while a Confederate victory, cost the South dearly and set the stage for Lee's fateful decision to invade the North again. These battles marked key moments in the struggle for the capitals and demonstrated how fragile and costly the war had become for both sides. By the summer of 1863, the Civil War had reached a critical juncture. The Confederacy had won several major victories, but the Union was beginning to gain momentum. The fate of the war would be determined by two decisive battles in July, Gettysburg in the east and Vicksburg in the west. These battles would mark the true turning points of the conflict, shifting the war permanently in favor of the Union. Gettysburg was the largest and bloodiest battle of the Civil War, fought from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, emboldened by his victory at Chancellorsville, decided to launch a second invasion of the North. He hoped that by winning a major battle on Union soil, he could force the North to seek peace and possibly gain foreign recognition for the Confederacy. Additionally, a victory in the North could relieve pressure on the war-torn South, giving Confederate forces time to regroup and resupply. Lee led his army of about 75,000 men into Pennsylvania, moving towards the small town of Gettysburg. Union forces under General George Meade had about 90,000 troops and were determined to stop Lee's advance. The battle began on July 1st when Confederate forces clashed with Union cavalry outside the town. The fighting quickly escalated, and by the end of the first day, the Confederates had pushed the Union troops back through the town, forcing them to take defensive positions on the high ground south of Gettysburg. On July 2nd, Lee launched a series of massive attacks on the Union flanks, targeting key positions such as Little Round Top, Devil's Den, and the Wheatfield. The fighting was brutal, with some of the bloodiest engagements of the war taking place that day. Union forces, though battered, managed to hold their ground, preventing Lee from gaining the decisive breakthrough he needed. The climax of the battle came on July 3rd with Pickett's charge. Believing the Union center was weak, Lee ordered a massive frontal assault with 2,500 men across an open field toward Cemetery Ridge. The charge was a disaster. Union artillery and rifle fire tore through the advancing Confederates, inflicting devastating casualties. Only a handful of Confederate soldiers made it to the Union lines, and those who did were quickly repelled. The attack failed, and Lee was forced to retreat. The Battle of Gettysburg was a turning point for several reasons. First, it marked the end of Lee's invasions of the North. He would never again attempt to launch an offensive on Union soil. Second, it inflicted heavy losses on the Confederacy, with Lee losing over 28,000 men, a third of his entire army. The South could not afford such losses, while the North, with its larger population, could continue to replenish its ranks. Finally, Gettysburg was a psychological blow to the Confederacy and a morale boost for the Union. It showed that the South could be defeated, even on the battlefield where Lee had been nearly unbeatable. A few months later, President Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address at the battlefield's dedication ceremony. In just a few short minutes, Lincoln reframed the war's purpose, not just as a struggle to preserve the Union, but as a fight for the principles of democracy and equality. He declared that the soldiers who had died at Gettysburg had given the last full measure of devotion so that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. The speech remains one of the most famous in American history and helped solidify the idea that the war was about more than just reunification. It was about the future of the nation and its founding ideals. While Gettysburg was a turning point, in the Eastern Theater, the Union was also making significant gains in the Western Theater. On the same day that Lee was retreating from Gettysburg, another crucial battle was coming to an end: the Siege of Vicksburg. Vicksburg, Mississippi, was the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. Its strategic importance was immense. Whoever controlled Vicksburg controlled the river, which was a vital transportation and supply route. Union General Ulysses S. Grant understood this and made capturing the city a top priority. If the Union could take Vicksburg, it would effectively split the Confederacy in two, cutting off Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the rest of the South. Grant launched a relentless campaign against the city in early 1863, maneuvering his troops to isolate Vicksburg from reinforcements. After a series of battles and daring river crossings, Union forces finally encircled the city by May. Unable to break through Grant's lines, Confederate General John Pemberton and his 30,000 men were trapped inside. For weeks, Grant's forces bombarded Vicksburg with artillery and cut off all supplies, starving the defenders and civilians inside. The siege lasted for over a month, and by July 4th, 1863, one day after the Union victory at Gettysburg, Pemberton finally surrendered. The fall of Vicksburg was one of the most significant victories of the war. It gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, effectively cutting the Confederacy in half. The loss was a devastating blow to the South, as it disrupted their ability to move troops and supplies across the river. It also cemented Ulysses S. Grant's reputation as the Union's most successful general, paving the way for his promotion to overall command of Union forces the following year. With the twin victories of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the tide of war had turned decisively in favor of the Union. Lee's army would remain on the defensive for the rest of the war, while the Confederacy struggled to recover from the loss of its western territories. These battles shattered any remaining hopes that the South could win through military force alone. From this point on, the Confederacy was fighting a defensive war, while the Union moved toward total victory. Gettysburg and Vicksburg were not just military turning points. They were symbolic of the larger shift in the war's momentum. Gettysburg demonstrated that the Confederacy could be beaten on Northern soil, and Vicksburg demonstrated that the Union's strategy of cutting off the South's resources was working. Together, these victories marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy and set the stage for the Union's final push toward victory. As the war entered its final phase, the Union's military strategy shifted toward delivering the final blow to the Confederacy. By mid-1864, the war had dragged on for more than 3 years, and while the Union had gained the upper hand with victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the Confederacy was still holding on. General Ulysses S. Grant, now the overall commander of Union forces, devised a plan to bring the war to an end through relentless, coordinated attacks on multiple fronts. One of the most crucial campaigns of this strategy was the push through Georgia, culminating in the Battle of Atlanta. The Battle of Atlanta, fought on July 22, 1864, was a decisive engagement in General William Tecumseh Sherman's campaign to capture the South's industrial and transportation hub. Atlanta was one of the Confederacy's most important cities. It housed weapons factories, railroads, and supply depots vital to the Southern war effort. Sherman knew that taking Atlanta would cripple the Confederacy's ability to continue the fight. The campaign to seize the city had begun months earlier, as Sherman's army of 100,000 men advanced through Georgia, engaging Confederate forces under General Joseph E. Johnston. Johnston, a skilled defensive strategist, avoided direct battles and instead conducted a series of strategic retreats, hoping to lure Sherman into an unwinnable position. However, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, frustrated by Johnston's unwillingness to engage the enemy, replaced him with the more aggressive General John Bell Hood. Unlike Johnston, Hood launched direct attacks against Sherman's army, but these assaults proved disastrous for the Confederacy. On July 22, Sherman's forces closed in on Atlanta. Hood launched a desperate counterattack, hoping to drive the Union army away, but his forces were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. After intense fighting, the Union army repelled the Confederate attack and tightened its grip on the city. Over the Ulysses next several weeks, Union forces bombarded Atlanta with artillery, destroying much of its infrastructure. On September 2, 1864, the city finally fell to Sherman's army. The capture of Atlanta was more than just a military victory. It had profound political consequences. The war had become increasingly unpopular in the North, and President Abraham Lincoln was facing a difficult re-election campaign against former Union General George McClellan. Many in the North were growing weary of the war's length and bloodshed, and McClellan was running on a platform of negotiating peace with the U.S. Confederacy. However, when news of Atlanta's fall reached the North, public opinion shifted dramatically. The victory proved that the Union was making significant progress, and Lincoln's re-election chances soared. In November 1864, Lincoln won a decisive victory, ensuring that the war would continue until the Confederacy was completely defeated. With Atlanta secured, Sherman launched his infamous March to the Sea. His army cut a path of destruction through Georgia, targeting railroads, factories, and farms to break the South's ability to wage war. This strategy of total war demoralized the Confederacy and hastened its collapse. Meanwhile, in Virginia, Grant was relentlessly pursuing Lee's army, forcing him into a final, desperate retreat. By early 1865, the Confederacy was in ruins. The Union had captured key cities, destroyed supply lines, and left the Southern economy in shambles. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, once the pride of the Confederacy, was reduced to a starving and exhausted force. After months of grueling battles, Lee's army attempted to escape westward, but Union forces surrounded them near Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. On April 9, 1865, Lee realized there was no hope of continuing the fight. His army was outnumbered, out of supplies, and unable to break through Union lines. Rather than see his men slaughtered in a hopeless battle, Lee decided to surrender. He met with Grant at the McLean House in Appomattox Courthouse, where the two generals negotiated the terms of surrender. Grant, knowing that the war was essentially over, offered generous terms to Lee and his men. He allowed Confederate soldiers to return home rather than face imprisonment and permitted them to keep their horses for farming. This act of leniency helped lay the groundwork for reconciliation between North and South. With Lee's surrender, the war was effectively over. While some smaller Confederate forces continued to fight for a few weeks, the fall of the Confederacy was inevitable. On April 14, 1865, just days after the surrender, President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. His death shocked the nation and cast a shadow over the victory, but the Union had been preserved, and slavery had been abolished. The Battle of Atlanta and Lee's surrender at Appomattox marked the final phase of the war. Atlanta's fall ensured Lincoln's re-election, allowing him to see the war through to its conclusion. The surrender at Appomattox represented not only the defeat of the Confederacy but also the beginning of the nation's long and difficult path toward Reconstruction. The Civil War had forever changed America, shaping its future and defining its struggle for unity and equality. The American Civil War was the deadliest conflict in the nation's history, leaving an indelible mark on the country. Throughout its 4 years, several pivotal battles shaped not only the war's outcome, but also the future of the United States. From the early clashes at Bull Run and Shiloh, to the turning points at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, and finally to the fall of Atlanta and Lee's surrender at Appomattox, each battle played a crucial role in determining the war's trajectory. The First Battle of Bull Run shattered any illusions that the war would be short and easy, proving that both sides were in for a long and grueling fight. Shiloh demonstrated the war's brutal nature and the Union's willingness to endure heavy losses for ultimate victory. In the Eastern Theater, battles like Antietam allowed President Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, transforming the war into a struggle for freedom and human rights. The turning points came in the summer of 1863, when the Union won decisive victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. Gettysburg halted Lee's invasion of the North and crippled the Confederate Army, while Vicksburg split the Confederacy in half, cutting off crucial resources. From that moment on, the South was on the defensive. By 1864, Sherman's victory in Atlanta ensured Lincoln's re-election, guaranteeing that the war would be fought to its conclusion. Finally, at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865, Lee's surrender marked the end of the Confederacy, sealing the Union's victory and bringing the war to a close. The Civil War's impact on the United States was profound and far-reaching. It preserved the Union, ensuring that the United States remained a single, unified nation. The war also led to the abolition of slavery, with the passage of the 13th Amendment permanently ending the institution that had divided the country for decades. However, the war's legacy extended beyond politics. It fundamentally reshaped American society, laying the foundation for the civil rights struggles that would continue into the 20th century and beyond. The Civil War's impact on the United States was profound and far-reaching. It preserved the Union, ensuring that the United States remained a single, unified nation. The war also led to the abolition of slavery, with the passage of the 13th Amendment permanently ending the institution that had divided the country for decades. However, the war's legacy extended beyond politics. It fundamentally reshaped American society, laying the foundation for the civil rights struggles that would continue into the 20th century and beyond. The cost of the war was immense. Over 600,000 Americans lost their lives, and much of the South was left in ruins. The challenges of Reconstruction would prove difficult, as the nation struggled to heal from its wounds and integrate formerly enslaved people into society. The scars of the war would linger for generations, but its outcome ensured that the United States would emerge stronger, more unified, and committed to the principles of democracy and equality. Ultimately, the Civil War was more than just a battle between North and South. It was a defining moment in American history that determined the future of the nation. The battles that shaped its course were not just military engagements, but turning points that changed the very fabric of the country. Through immense sacrifice and perseverance, the United States endured, proving that its ideals of freedom and unity could withstand even the greatest of trials.